When a nation is fighting for its very existence, trust becomes more dangerous than bullets. That is the message Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sends to Donald Trump ahead of his potential peace talks with Vladimir Putin. In politics, words can disguise intentions, and in war, misplaced trust can destroy nations. Zelensky's warning is not just about Ukraine. It's about the reality of dealing with a leader like Putin, whose strategies have long relied on deception, manipulation, and the exploitation of weakness. This moment is not only about whether peace can be reached, but about what kind of peace will be accepted. One that secures freedom, or one that sells it to the highest bidder. Zelensky cautions Trump about Putin's history of broken promises and manipulative tactics. When Zelensky warns Trump not to trust Putin, he is not speaking from speculation or political rivalry. He is speaking from years of experience, from watching how Russia has engaged with Ukraine and with the broader world. Putin has a long history of using words as weapons, promising one thing at the negotiation table and delivering something entirely different on the battlefield. This is not merely a matter of political disagreement. It is a well-documented strategy that relies on deception to buy time, to confuse opponents, and to fracture alliances. For Ukraine, these are not abstract lessons but lived realities. In 2014, Russia signed agreements in Minsk promising peace and withdrawal, only to continue supporting separatists in the Donbas region, prolonging a war that has killed thousands. Each diplomatic move was not a step toward peace, but a calculated maneuver to strengthen Russia's hand while weakening its opponents. Zelensky knows that history repeats itself when lessons go unlearned. Trump, with his instinctive style of deal-making, often prides himself on being able to read people, to see through their strategies and cut directly to the truth of the matter. But Zelensky's caution is a reminder that with someone like Putin, personal instincts are not enough. Putin's tactics are not about personality, they are about power. They are rooted in a worldview where trust is seen not as a bridge, but as a weapon, where the appearance of cooperation is simply a mask for domination. To step into talks with him, believing that promises will hold simply because they were spoken aloud, is to walk into a trap. What Zelensky is really pointing out here is the fundamental asymmetry between leaders who value agreements and those who value leverage. In democratic nations, words carry weight because they are tied to systems of accountability. Leaders know that broken promises will face public scrutiny and institutional checks. In authoritarian systems like Putin's Russia, however, words are tools to be discarded the moment they cease to be useful. There is no accountability, no consequence for dishonesty, only the pursuit of power at any cost. That is why Ukraine's leader insists that any talk of peace must be accompanied by realism, by the awareness that nothing spoken by Putin can be taken at face value. At a deeper level, this is not just about Ukraine or even about Trump. It is about how the world chooses to engage with regimes that operate by different rules. If the West fails to recognize the manipulative tactics of leaders like Putin, then it risks repeating the same mistakes of the past, mistaking temporary pauses for lasting solutions, and walking away from negotiations, believing that peace is secured, only to find that conflict has merely shifted shape. Zelensky's warning, then, is not simply strategic, it is existential. For Ukraine, trusting Putin has already proven deadly. For Trump, and for anyone engaging with Russia, to ignore that history is to risk legitimizing the very tactics that undermine peace itself. And this is why Zelensky's caution matters. Because peace built on broken promises is not peace at all. It is surrender dressed in diplomacy. The warning is clear: trust must not be given where trust has never been honored. Zelensky stresses that any peace agreement must safeguard Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. When Zelensky emphasizes that any peace agreement must protect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, he is not making a negotiator's demand. He is laying down the very foundation of what peace means for his people. For Ukraine, sovereignty is not a theoretical concept. It is the difference between being a free nation and being reduced once again to a pawn on someone else's chessboard. Since Russia's invasion in 2014 and its full-scale assault in 2022, Ukrainians have lived with the daily reality of their borders being violated, their land occupied, and their citizens subjected to war. For them, Talk of peace that does not include the restoration of sovereignty is not peace at all. It is simply submission under another name. That is why Zelensky insists that sovereignty must remain at the core of every discussion, no matter how difficult or prolonged the negotiations may become. The principle of sovereignty is also about dignity. Nations, like individuals, cannot survive without dignity. To accept an agreement where Ukraine is forced to give up its territory in exchange for a temporary cessation of violence would be to legitimize aggression. It would signal to the world that brute force pays off, that invasions can be rewarded, and that international law is only as strong as the power behind it. Zelensky's position reminds us that peace without justice is fragile because it creates wounds that never truly heal. If Ukraine were compelled to sign away Crimea or the Donbass under the pressure of negotiations, those concessions would not resolve the conflict. They would only guarantee that conflict returns later, sharper and more destructive. A peace agreement that sacrifices sovereignty is not a solution, but an invitation to further violations. From a broader perspective, this principle extends beyond Ukraine's borders. If the sovereignty of one nation can be negotiated away to appease an aggressor, then every smaller nation stands vulnerable. The message to the world would be dangerous that the rules-based international order is optional and that the rights of weaker nations can be rewritten by the stronger. That is why Zelensky's insistence resonates so strongly. It is not only about Ukraine's future, but about preserving the very concept of international stability. Sovereignty is what ensures that global politics does not devolve into a permanent state of might makes right. For Trump or any leader attempting to negotiate a settlement, this reality presents a profound challenge. A deal that does not secure Ukraine's sovereignty may look appealing on the surface. It could be marketed as ending the war or stopping the bloodshed. But beneath that veneer, it would plant the seeds of future instability. Zelensky's warning highlights the temptation of quick solutions, the kind that give the appearance of peace while leaving the underlying problem unresolved. Real peace takes longer, demands more sacrifice, and refuses to trade essential truths for temporary relief. At the human level, sovereignty is also about belonging. Ukrainians are fighting not only for territory, but for their right to define themselves as a free people. Their language, their culture, their institutions, these are not bargaining chips to be shuffled in negotiations. They are the very essence of their identity. To compromise on sovereignty would be to compromise on the identity of Ukraine itself, reducing a nation's history and future to a negotiable commodity. That is something Zelensky cannot and will not allow. And so his position is unambiguous, no matter how appealing the rhetoric of peace might sound. If sovereignty and territorial integrity are not protected, then the agreement is hollow. His message is both a warning and a principle, that real peace cannot be built on concessions that erase the very existence of a nation. For Ukraine to survive as Ukraine, sovereignty must remain untouchable. Zelensky reminds the world that Russia has a history of breaking promises and violating previous agreements, making blind trust dangerous. When Zelensky warns that Russia cannot be blindly trusted because of its track record of breaking promises, he is not speaking in abstractions. He is drawing directly from the lived experience of his country and from the historical record. Time and again, agreements meant to bring stability have been signed, celebrated, and then quietly violated by the very party that swore to uphold them. For Ukraine, the clearest example lies in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. In that agreement, Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Russia explicitly pledged to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and borders. Yet, less than 2 decades later, it annexed Crimea and supported armed separatists in the Donbass, shattering those commitments. This betrayal remains burned into the Ukrainian consciousness, serving as an enduring reminder that words on paper mean little when not backed by genuine trust and accountability. The same pattern repeated with the Minsk agreements, negotiated to bring a ceasefire to eastern Ukraine. These deals were supposed to freeze hostilities and lay the groundwork for a political solution. Instead, Russia used them as a stalling tactic, a way to regroup, strengthen its military presence, and prepare for deeper incursions. Every promise of restraint was followed by escalation. Every handshake followed by renewed aggression. This is the cycle Zelensky is pointing to when he cautions leaders like Trump against taking Russian promises at face value. The problem is not one of miscommunication or misunderstanding. It is one of deliberate strategy. Breaking promises has become a tool of statecraft, a way of manipulating opponents who remain eager for peace into accepting terms that only serve to weaken them further. Zelensky's warning speaks to a broader truth about international politics. Trust cannot be given freely when history has repeatedly shown that it will be abused. Diplomatic language often celebrates compromise and goodwill, but the reality is harsher. Goodwill must be earned, not assumed, and history must be acknowledged if the future is to be secure. Blind trust, in this case, is not a virtue. It is a liability. It risks granting an aggressor exactly what they seek, the chance to regroup and strike again under the guise of peace. This is why Zelensky insists that promises from Russia must be treated with skepticism, and that any negotiation must be coupled with mechanisms for enforcement, verification, and accountability. Without these, agreements become nothing more than illusions. From a psychological standpoint, the repetition of betrayal has an effect not just on political leaders, but on the people they represent. Ukrainians have lived through broken promises, and they know that each false peace carries a devastating cost. Every agreement that fails is not just a diplomatic misstep. It translates into destroyed homes, displaced families, and lives cut short. Trust, once broken at this scale, cannot be repaired by optimistic rhetoric. It requires actions, consistency, and accountability over time, none of which Russia has demonstrated in recent years. Zelensky's reminder, therefore, is not just directed at Trump, but at the entire international community. Learn from history, or be doomed to repeat it. What makes his point so pressing is that the allure of easy peace is always strong. Leaders seeking political victories may be tempted to believe that words are enough, that signing an agreement signals resolution. But history shows otherwise. Without trust that is grounded in consistent behavior, agreements are merely pauses between conflicts. Zelensky's voice cuts through the noise by insisting that blind faith in Russian promises is not only naive but dangerous, both for Ukraine and for global stability. His message is ultimately a call to vigilance. Peace that is based on empty assurances is not peace at all, but the quiet before another storm. To safeguard the future, the world must refuse to be lulled by familiar promises from a state that has repeatedly violated them. This is why Zelensky's warning matters. It is not born of cynicism, but of hard-earned experience. When we step back and look at the picture in full, Zelensky's warning is not just a tactical note aimed at one negotiation. It is a profound lesson about the nature of power, promises, and history. Nations, like individuals, reveal their character not by what they say in moments of negotiation, but by what they consistently do when no one is watching. Russia's repeated violations of treaties and assurances demonstrate that words alone cannot anchor peace. What Zelensky is asking the world, and especially leaders like Trump, to recognize is that peace without trust is an illusion, and illusions in geopolitics come at the cost of lives. This is why his message resonates beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. It is a universal reminder that true stability cannot be built on broken foundations. If the past teaches anything, it is that hope must be balanced with vigilance and optimism with realism. Agreements that ignore history are fragile. They collapse at the first test. Leaders who forget this truth risk not only their own credibility, but also the security of millions who depend on their judgment. Zelensky's conclusion is simple but unyielding. Don't be deceived by promises that have already been broken. Demand accountability. Demand consistency. Demand actions that prove intentions before offering trust. Because in matters of war and peace, blind faith does not protect the innocent, it endangers them. And so the responsibility falls not just on Trump or on Ukraine, but on the entire world to listen to this warning. For if trust is given where it is undeserved, the cycle of betrayal will only continue. But if trust is made to rest on truth, accountability, and genuine change, then real peace, however difficult, becomes possible. Until then, vigilance is the only safeguard. True peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of trust. And trust must be earned, not assumed.